filter in, which is terrific. We will wait a minute or two to give time for everyone to be here. So once I see the number of participants starting to kind of level out, we will get started. Okay, it looks like it's still going up, but well, no, you know what? It's still going up. So let me give it another 30 seconds or so. It's good to see that we have such a robust attendance. Okay. Let's get started. So thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation about the ethics of organized travel to Israel, Palestine. My name is Peter Beinart. I'm editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, which is sponsoring this event. Before I introduce our terrific panelists, just a couple of words of background. The idea for this panel came as the result of an episode at Jewish Currents in which Jewish Currents ran an ad for travel to Palestine, Israel by the DeRote Foundation, and then for various reasons apologized for that ad, which created a lot of discussion both inside the magazine and beyond. And this conversation is not aimed at relitigating that decision because, frankly, it's not actually that decision, and the specifics are not as interesting, I think, as the broader question of what are the ethics? When is it ethical and when is not ethical for people from outside Israel, Palestine to go on organized tours, given the reality of the situation there? I would also say, by way of full disclosure, that I myself have, over the course of my adult life, been on such organized tours. Ilana actually was the organizer of one of them for the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. I also went on such a program with Encounter. And the last point I wanted to make was that we are at Jewish Currents well aware that in this panel of the four of us, it is not equally balanced between Palestinians and Jews. And we do try to take very seriously, given the historical marginalization of Palestinians in the United States from these kind of debates, these questions of equity. In putting together the panel, we reached out to Eyewitness Palestine because of its unique perspective and work. Eyewitness Palestine, in its mission statement, defines itself as an organization that centers the narratives, histories, and lived experiences of Palestinians. And Eyewitness Palestine collectively decided that Emily would be the spokesperson that they would want to have representing the organization, and we're thrilled to have her. We're disabling the chat, but if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Most of this conversation will be between us, but in the kind of back half of the hour, we may incorporate some of the questions from the Q&A. So let me introduce our panelists. Seb Bahor is a Palestinian-American business consultant from Ramallah and a frequent political commentator. Emily Siegel is the program director at Eyewitness Palestine, and Ilana Sumka is an educator and activist, the founder of the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and most recently the founder of a new organization, Shlemut, which deals with the problem of what has been called progressive except Palestine, the failure of people who consider themselves progressive in other ways to actually align those values with the moral challenges in Palestine, Israel. So I'm going to start with a broad question for all of you, and I'll start with Ilana. All three of you have had a lot of personal experience in various ways with organized trips that take people to visit Israel, Palestine. And I'm interested in hearing how that personal experience has shaped your views of the ethics of such travel. And Ilana, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Peter. It's really nice to be here with you and with Emily and Sam. I moved to Israel in 2004 on a DeRote Fellowship and an organized year-long free trip to Israel. And that year was really eye-opening for me. I went as a person who was progressive, except on Palestinians. And through that trip, through that year, I had the opportunity to go on a lot of trips throughout Israel and into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. There was one moment in particular, actually a year later, that stands out to me that I always think back to when I think about why has leading delegations into the West Bank and the occupied territories become such an important part of my work for the last 18 years. And it was the first time I was in Bethlehem. My very dear friend from my Dorot year, Shana Tabak, had arm twisted me into coming to Bethlehem with her. And this is a program that had been started by rabbis Miriam Margles and Melissa Weintraub. And for various complicated reasons, I had to leave the program in the middle of it. And I had to go through a checkpoint. I had to go through checkpoint 300 at Rachel's tomb. And I had to go by myself. And Shane had explained to me how to do it. And it sounded sort of clear, but I didn't totally understand the middle part. And I got to the middle part of the checkpoint after going through a couple of turnstiles. And because it was the middle of the day, all of the turnstiles were closed, completely locked. And I didn't know where to go. And I can't say this without chuckling at myself. I looked around for a help desk, but there aren't help desks in checkpoints. They're not set up that way. And so I shouted out, I had to get through. Hello, is anyone there? Hello. And all of a sudden, an Israeli soldier appeared with a gun pointed towards me. And in that instant, I realized that he could have shot me. He could have thought I was Palestinian. And I realized that I was having a fraction of an experience of what Palestinians go through on a daily basis. And it took that level of fear and embodied experience to even get a glimpse of what life is like under occupation for Palestinians. And since then, I've been working to bring particularly Jewish groups into the occupied territories, both with Encounter for educational experiences and with Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And when I think about the question that's been posed to us, I take two givens. One is that at least pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, 3 to 4 million tourists travel to Israel every year. And those numbers are probably going to be coming back. So that's a lot of folks coming to Israel. And two, from the story that I just shared, my experience, my personal experience as a participant on one of these programs, and then going on to run them, is that although there are a lot of tools in the activist toolkit, and we can talk about what some of those tools are, in my experience, there's nothing more powerful and more eye-opening and more transformative than a personal visit to the region. So if we take those two factors together, that the travel is going to happen and these delegations and these visits have the potential to be the most transformative way to expand Palestine solidarity work, what do we do with that? How then do we think about the ethics of Israel travel? So I have three starting thoughts that I'll share before I kind of pass the baton. The first is that it seems to me that this moment calls for a task force on thinking this through, and it obviously needs to be Palestinian-led. It needs to have a bunch of folks, and stuff, folks like my friend Shana Tabak, who was the person who arm twisted me to see the things that I didn't want to see, that I didn't know I needed to see. And a task force can come together, taking into consideration ways that Palestinian communities are impacted, ways that these trips can be done well, because there's a way to do them well, there are ways to do them well, and there are ways to do them poorly. And I'll just share anecdotally, there was once an AIPAC board member who said to me, oh, I don't need to go on an Encounter trip. I've been to Ramallah. He went on a chartered bus. He never stepped off. He didn't have to go through by foot a checkpoint, had met Mahmoud Abbas, and then left. And he had ticked the box. So we do have to really ask carefully, what does it mean to do this? And I think that there's a lot of smart folks out there, like Sam, like Emily, who are thinking about these questions and who could really put them down. And my hope would be that we would come up with a set of criteria that are a stretch, but doable. So for example, we say everyone doing one of these delegations, one of these trips, has to spend at least 20% of their time with Palestinians, investing their time, their resources, their attention. 20% is not a magic number. It is the population of Palestinians, more or less, living within Israel. Then you can run a campaign. You can go to institutions and say, do you invest 20% of your resources? You're doing this organized trip to Israel, you're doing a year in Israel, you're doing 10 days in Israel. Do you put 20%, X percent of your resources into this. So I offer that as a starting point. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. I noticed in the Q&A that someone wanted to restate this opening question, so I will do that, which is, how has your personal experience shaped your views about the ethics of organized travel from outside to Israel-Palestine? And I'll turn to you, Sam. You've seen this, although you're an American, you've also seen this from the other side as a Palestinian who lives in Ramallah. What have you learned from your experiences about the ethics of this kind of organized travel?
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for having the panel. It's an important topic. I've been speaking to groups on Palestine-Israel for the last 30 years. I started with Youngstown, Ohio, bringing Palestinian American youth and media people and various small constituencies. And that happened during the first Intifada. After relocating to Palestine in 1994, 1995, from the second Intifada, my talks were mainly focused on solidarity groups, which was largely preaching to the choir, to be honest with you, which is many times needed because people need to be kept up to date about what's happening on the ground. Thanks specifically to Ilana, because when she was working with Encounter, she asked to see me. How she found me, I have no idea, even though I can't be missed, I'm kind of a big guy. And she sat down with me and convinced me that it would be important to speak to Jewish groups coming from the US. And these are not Jewish solidarity groups. These are people who are mainstream, whether rabbis or leaders of organizations. That was the beginning of about a 12-year now run, speaking with Jewish groups. And I also attend and speak to some select Israeli groups as well. Today, the number of organizations bringing American groups are many. There's Encounter, Extend, bringing students, Jewish students, J Street, Americans for Peace Now, Israeli Policy Forum, Beit Salem, If Not Now, and of course, Eyewitness Palestine, and many, many others. I basically have one red line in terms of talking to these groups, which is no settlers knowingly. I've been asked to go to settlements. I've been asked to meet settler groups, and that's a thing that I won't do. We can talk about that later. My motto in doing this, and it's thought out, because I need to mention as well that there's a boycott, divestment, sanction movement here who doesn't have my opinion. They basically say if someone is coming to visit, to meet with Palestinians, they must be coming solely for the purpose of visiting Palestine and not even go to Israel. I personally have a different opinion. My motto after thinking this through is to reverse systemic indoctrination, which is I think what has happened to the Jewish American and Jewish community in general. We must engage and educate. And when I say engage and educate, I don't mean people-to-people projects where we go to Cyprus and swim together. That's not what we're talking about when I speak of engaging. If I'm invited to make the case for my struggle, for my freedom, that is a platform that I will take the full opportunity to jump on. I can talk more about the different layers of the issue, which we'll, I'm sure, get to in a second here. But that, I think, is the most important thing. If we realize that the other side is indoctrinated, even Israelis, who we, as a community in Palestine, if you ask people in the street, how much do you think the Israelis know about us or about the occupation? They would say every single Israeli knows every single thing about what happens here. It's all their fault. When you sit down with Jewish Americans, with many Israelis, you'll find that they don't. The indoctrination has been so deep and for so long that unless you have a personal experience, like being in the army for this conscription army and ending up in Hebron and doing something in Hebron which made you not feel right, you really don't, because not everybody who joins the Israeli military is assigned to the occupation. So that's my kind of motto in addressing this, and I'll get to the details later.
Sam, that was terrific. Just one very quick follow-up. We had a question from someone who didn't hear the second part of your phrase, no settlers, no blank. And I actually also missed it. So just maybe you repeat
no
that.
Settlers knowingly. If I'm speaking to a group and there happens to be a settler there who has not identified himself as a settler, I don't actually take a blood test or do a litmus test with people coming into the room, but I will not organize with a settler group. That's my meaning.
Terrific. Emily, the same question to you. How has your experience with organized trips to Palestine, Israel shaped your views about the ethics of such travel?
Sure, thank you. And I appreciate being a part of this panel. And, I do want to talk at some point, maybe not right this moment, but a little bit about how I ended up on this panel versus my amazing colleagues who are both Palestinian. But to start, before I started working at Eyewitness Palestine 11 years ago, I had a long personal experience of my own travel as a Jewish American going to Palestine and going to Israel through various different programs. And certainly those experiences affected my own personal outlook. And I don't necessarily want to get into all of those experiences, but you can read about them in a really wonderful book that's called, now I'm of course blanking on the name, but I'll put a link of it into the chat in a moment. But for me, what I've learned about ethical travel has really come from my time working at Eyewitness Palestine and learning from the folks who founded the organization before me, and especially the folks that have been working with me over the last 10 years. And I think what I've learned is that there are a set of, I don't know if I'd call them red lines, but a set of values that we put into our program that we believe is the way to make travel ethical. And so I want to talk about a few of those. So one is that we center our delegations within a racial justice framework. And what this means is that we're not exceptionalizing Palestine. We're not looking at Palestine as this one issue or a conflict that's happening, but we're looking at it in terms of a form of white supremacy, a form of settler colonialism that affects people all over the world. And it's also a way to be able to center the work that is done around Palestine to connect it to work that's done in the US where we're based, where settler colonialism and where white supremacy certainly plays a huge role in the systems that we work in here. The second is that we think a lot about conflict tourism versus ethical tourism, and that there's a difference between that. One is understanding the power imbalance. So even thinking about this needing a balanced number of Palestinians or Israelis, to us, or Palestinians and Jews, which even that is problematic, to us, that balance, there is no balance in what's happening there. And there is a huge power imbalance. So the ability to have dual narratives or to try and balance the different aspects is just impossible. That doesn't exist. When people ask if our trips are balanced, we say, yeah, they're balanced towards justice. And for us, that's the balance that we're trying to achieve in our programming. I would say also, a key way that we try to make our delegations ethical tourism versus conflict tourism is that folks who come on our delegations have to do something with what they learn there. What that is up to them. We don't prescribe that they have to get involved in any sort of specific activism, but it can be anything from running BDS campaigns to advocating for Palestinian justice and liberation, to congressional representatives, to doing an art exhibit, or producing plays or books that many of our delegates have written. But the fact is that we believe that if you're going there as an outsider and you're having Palestinians use their emotional labor and their physical time and energy to speak to you, then they need to get something beyond just you hearing them. It needs to expand from there into action. And so for our trips, everyone has to sign a waiver actually saying, I agree to do something when I return. And then I would say, for our trips, actually, we do work directly with the Boycott National Committee, which Sam mentioned, and our trips are audited by them. And I would say, for us, we do go into Israel. We do meet with Israelis. We meet with Israelis who are working specifically in solidarity with Palestinians. But there's never been an issue within the BNC with us meeting with Israelis. I think from my understanding is that the Boycott National Committee also understands that people come and they go all over the place, but they want to make sure, again, that the trips that are coming have a specific goal with acting towards Palestinian liberation, and not just coming to here to visit and then leave and go back to what they've been doing before they went. And I think for me, as a Jewish American, and my own personal experience there, I know that my privilege is always on me. Anywhere I walk there, I have a huge privilege. And so for us, understanding that privilege and making sure that anyone who joins our delegations are aware of the privileges we bring, either as internationals, whether we're Jewish or otherwise, as folks who can leave at the end. So even Palestinians who are from the diaspora or living in the diaspora who are coming there have the ability to leave at the end of the trip. So, if there was an issue that they had with the army, they're not stuck there to deal with the consequences of that. But also the privileges, within our groups of how going there is very different for each person. For me, as a Jewish American, I see myself going there as a visitor. I don't believe that I have any right over that land. I don't believe that I have any connection as a Jewish American. My family is not from that region. My family is an Ashkenazi, white, European Jewish family. We have no ties that we can go to that region. Whereas if I'm traveling with a Palestinian American, their family directly has ties to that region. Their great-grandparents were born there. Maybe their grandparents were born there. Their parents may have been born there. And all of them can't go. And so I think it's, for me, thinking about travel I think it's important that we're going with this sort of diverse group in order to uncover those privileges and in order to center the different privileges that we bring with us as we're traveling, as well as the ways that Palestinians who are not living there and who are in the diaspora, the ways in which they have to balance what it means to be a visitor there and to be seen as someone who, yes, there's a privilege where you can leave, but there's also there's also a negative where you can't stay, and it makes it very hard, and you're treated as a visitor in your own homeland. So those, I think I'll wrap up there, but I think just thinking about the ways in which there are programs that focus on Jewish Americans and then our program that doesn't. And I think for us, that actually is a very big distinction, to try and break away from the understanding of it's a right, or it's inevitable that Jews should go there, are going to go there, or should go there. And instead think about it as, no, we're going there with a purpose of promoting peace, justice, equality for Palestinians and for everyone all over the world.
That's great. Thank you, all three of you, you put so much on the table, and we're also getting a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A, which I'll try to incorporate. Elan, I want to go back to you. Emily mentioned that Eyewitness Palestine has a requirement that that when people go on these trips, they commit to doing something. So it isn't just anthropology, but they're making some contribution. Now, of course, there's certain kinds of American Jews who would not go on such a program if they knew that was going to be required. But it does guard against the danger that Palestinians invest this time and energy and labor and don't actually see any reward from it in terms of their own freedom. So I'm interested in what you think about that. And also want to ask you, in addition to that, to broaden it out a little bit, there are organizations that operate in a kind of intermediate space, like Dorot, where they do give visitors the opportunity to engage with Palestinians, but they don't actually even require that. So I wonder how you might think about those two different categories.
Thanks. I'm going to speak to the first one, and if I forget what the second one is, will you remind me?
Absolutely.
So one of the ways that I think about this is that there's an important distinction, and there's overlap between them, between learning and activism. Now, hopefully they're related, and hopefully they're on a continuum. But when I directed Encounter in Jerusalem, I was predominantly and explicitly wearing an educator's hat. And part of being an educator, to some extent, is trusting and allowing the people who go through an educational process to reach their own conclusions. Now, it seemed obvious to me as a private individual that the only conclusion that one can reach after spending some days in the West Bank is that the occupation is the biggest moral stain on the state of Israel, and that it's our responsibility and incumbent upon us as Jews to take steps to end the occupation and to work for equality. That was my personal obvious takeaway, and that's what I personally wanted to see people come in with. But if I started with that when I was directing Encounter, I would have precluded the participation of the very people who I wanted to reach. And so I had to trust as an educator that people were going to come to their own kind of eye-opening conclusions, and that those conclusions also can look different. That even if I had what was my very clear conclusion, also part of the educational process is allowing for diversity of opinions and perspectives and outcome. And having said that, after directing Encounter for 5 years in Jerusalem, personally, I no longer felt that education was where I wanted to pour my heart and soul. And that's what led me to found the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. That was part of my way of saying to Sam Bahor and Dawood Nasser. It was when Dawood Nasser from the Tent of Nations called me a couple years after I had left Jerusalem. We were on the phone because the Israeli army had uprooted hundreds of fruit trees from his land. And I asked him how I could help. And I thought he was going to ask, for fundraising effort, which I would have been happy to do. And he said it would be really meaningful if you would bring a Jewish solidarity group to come replant trees to show that the Israeli army's bulldozers don't represent Jewish values. And so I made what was for me a very natural step and progression from being in the role of an educator to being in the role of an activist. And part of what I want to say about this differentiation between education and activism is that it does take sometimes seemingly contradictory strategies in the same movement. And I think that's hard. And I think folks get upset about that. And I understand it. It's taken me a long time to get my head around what that means. But part of what it means is it means meeting people where they're at. And folks are at different places. Some people are going to go on an Encounter trip. Some people are going to come on Dorot. Some people are going to come with Eyewitness Palestine. And what I would like to see from an ethics perspective is that everyone stretch themselves. So if you already know that you are a Palestine solidarity person and you're based in the States and you're going to the region, then you should stretch yourself by going to do solidarity work on the ground. Peter, what was the second part of the question?
The second was about organizations that create an opportunity, but don't actually even require that you engage with Palestinians. So even a kind of less or lower level.
Yeah. So that's where I think a task force and a standard of ethics comes into play, because I think we're at a point where the occupation has gone on for so long, where there's been no kind of retribution or restitution post-Nakba. There's obviously no two-state solution, that the bar needs to be raised. It's time to set the bar. There is no bar for these kinds of organizations. They don't, if you ask an organization that does travel to Israel, organized travel to Israel, even if they have the opportunity, what do you think the ethics should be? I don't think they know. I don't think they've necessarily thought about it, or they will become defensive. And so part of what I think we can do as a movement is say, this is what we think it means to do ethical travel. And to generate this set of criteria, Palestinian-led task force that is funded, because I'm not interested in asking anyone, particularly not Palestinians, to do free labor, say, this is what we expect, this is what we need. Once you have a campaign, once you set a bar somewhere, then you can hold people accountable to those standards. But in the absence of that, it's kind of a free-for-all and folks don't know. But one of the takeaways, and this is the last thing I'll say of this, is that from the years that I directed Encounter in Jerusalem, part of what happened is that every single rabbinical student who came to Israel wanted to go on an Encounter trip. It became understood that this was a thing that you had to do in your time in Israel. And the more that we can make it understood through educational, cultural kind of transformation, the more people are going to stretch themselves. We have to keep raising the bar and help people stretch themselves towards it.
Sam, I think sometimes when people come from outside to these trips, they're put on a bus, they end up, they're taken to a hotel, and all of a sudden someone like you comes and speaks to them. They may not really have much of a sense of what the labor is involved in for you or another Palestinian is involved, both the physical labor of actually just getting there, given Palestinians' lack of basic rights, and also maybe the emotional, psychological labor of having to again and again and again kind of say things that are basic, and maybe even having to kind of explain one's own humanity to people who don't necessarily haven't been taught to value it. And I suspect that may be part of the reason that some Palestinians are hesitant about these interactions. And I'd just love you to talk about what your experience has been like in that regard.
Sure. Wow. It's developed over time, to be honest with you. I used to, we know our struggle very well. So there wasn't much preparation when I first started doing this. I would go and speak what I need to speak about. And I get hit and miss. If somebody got it, great. If not, too bad. Maybe I didn't do well, or maybe they didn't want to hear what I had to say. Over time, I've become much more attuned to how to approach these groups, hoping to find a result from engaging with them. For example, when I'm asked to speak to a group, I will ask for either the participants' names, profiles, or at least the profile of the group. Before I even accept or not accept. That's something now kind of like a prerequisite for me. And I will prepare based on what the group background is. If they're educators, if they're business people, there's different approaches to speaking. And I will look at the actual profiles, of the people who are coming, to try to address things that might tick with them. And when I actually go and speak to groups, and Ilana will know this very well because it's my ending at every single Encounter group, and you've witnessed one as well, or more than one maybe, is my door is open. That doesn't happen with many speakers, but my door is open post your tour if you want to come back, because in an hour and a half, there's no way I can make a full case for anything. And you would be shocked about from the number of people, Jewish Americans mainly, who ring the next day or the next week or the next year sometimes and ask to come and visit, or to have a Skype call, or to engage, sometimes in a very long process over email. And I can say, I don't want to say hundreds, but for sure dozens of people have done that with me. And that's where I can start to measure the impact of speaking to people, of engaging people. And remember, these are not people in the solidarity movement. These are people who are coming sometimes very anti-Palestinian. They have stereotypes which are kind of like knee-jerk reactions to anything I have to say. When that happens, I start to value the engagements much, much more. And I can talk for a long time about specific cases where people have become engaged. For example, Encounter, as Ilana was correctly saying, views their role as an educator role, and they don't go further than that. I can say that from Encounter, people have gone further. And many of them, to pick up on the last question you asked, Ilana, are people within the educator community inside the Jewish establishment or inside Israel, who have then said, wow, and I can say this with a lot of examples, wow, I'm a mature leader in my community, either as a rabbi or as an educator, and I didn't know anything about what I'm seeing. And that pisses them off. And when they go back into their community, a lot of times they say, first and foremost, whether I agree with Sam or I don't, first and foremost, I want my constituency, whether it's my synagogue or my educational platform, to have the same experience. So Dorot is a good example. Dorot, I forget the details, someone from Dorot came on a trip with Encounter, and they heard me speak, and they heard many others as well. And then after a period of time, I got a call from Dorot directly saying, we have a group here, it's optional, but we would like you to come to Jerusalem to address them. I will not miss an opportunity to speak to a group of people who are becoming newly introduced to what's happening in the reality inside Israel. And I've done that, I think, more than once. I used to be able to drive to Jerusalem. I can no longer do that after becoming a Palestinian resident. So that has happened less frequently. But the number of people who have woken up and have acted in many, many different ways is a testament that there is a value to doing this. Having said that, and I want to use an example that yesterday I was telling my Harvard senior daughter that I'm going to have this talk, and we were engaging because she said, wow, you know, there's an Israel trek coming out of Harvard, and I'm going to work to make it not happen. So I wonder, did they call you? Are you going to speak to them? And I said, not yet, but if they do, I probably will. She goes, that's okay, I don't care. And I said, what do you mean? That sounds like a contradiction. And she goes, and I 100% agree with her. This issue of trips, which are designed to kind of whitewash the Israeli reality, are for us Palestinians an educational platform to make an issue about how the trip is being organized and trying to get Palestine on their agenda, or at least make a case about it. And then she said, but some people are going to go for sure because it's a free trip. And you know, students, we like anything free. So when they get there on the ground, I hope you speak to them, because once they make the effort to get here, it would be a lost opportunity if they just get the partying in Tel Aviv and forget that 40 minutes away is an apartheid system, if not inside Tel Aviv where they are. So I thought that was a nuance that was rather important. Try to make an educational issue about the trip. If there was a bar that was defined, like Ilana is speaking about, that would be even better. But once people get here, we need to act on them. The last thing I'll say, there's actually a Palestinian Jewish Israeli cooperative based out of Jaffa, a friend of mine, Fred Shmoka. He created something called Green Olive Tours. And his thing is that he will find Jewish-oriented conferences that are coming to Israel, which are many, especially before COVID. And these are conferences which are very sometimes right-wing, sometimes just about something non-conflict related. And he will go market to the people inside the hotels that are coming to that conference, hey, you're here for a week. Why don't you have a tour in English for 1 day or half a day or 2 days? And you would be surprised about the high-level senior people who have taken up that opportunity to come and have dinner here. And it's an eye-opener for them. And I'm actually planning on writing a book about this experience. That's how valuable it is. I'll stop there. There's so much more to say.
No, that was tremendously valuable. And we're also just the questions in the chat and the comments are very powerful and rich. Speak to how many people on this call have their own experiences with this. Emily, I wanted to kind of ask you a version of that same question about the labor and costs involved for Palestinians. As you said, your colleagues at Eyewitness Palestine are Palestinian, and I think that one hears often the echoes of this often in the conversation in the United States between Black and white Americans, where Black Americans say, you know, why do I have the burden of basically teaching you about racism in the United States? So I'd like to ask you about how you and your colleagues think about and have experienced this question. I think it maybe even have something to do with why you're the person on this panel. So, or why you were selected from the organization. So I'd love you to kind of take a crack at this too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, I will say one thing that I think is important that I just want to bring up to the end of, Sam, where you ended off, is for me, and I would say for Eyewitness Palestine, people getting to know others and hearing that story and the education is not going to change the situation for Palestinians. And the situation is so dire and needs to be changed right away that we don't have time for these conversations to happen. People go, they have their eyes open, they go back to their communities, and do they really work to change something? Very rarely do they. And I will say it from my own perspective and from my own experience, I had a lot of these like learning experiences where I was very touched and I was very moved. And it wasn't until I came back and came into a program at American University where I was confronted by Palestinian students there who said, okay, so you understand what are you doing to change it? And I said, well, I mean, I'm just a person. I can't do, like, what can I do? And they said, well, if you're not going to do anything, then why did they have that conversation with you? Why did they spend time talking to you? And again, just because there's a new understanding, it like saying that is the key to changing things there is like saying there's a misconception in the Jewish community of what's happening there. There's not a misconception in the Jewish community about what is happening there. There's a strategic, specific system that is purposefully not having Jewish people and not having most people outside of Palestine in general understand what actually is happening there. And until we change these systems, until we change the structures that are allowing for the inequality and oppression of Palestinians throughout Palestine, including inside 48, that's not going to change. And so for me, I think this goes back to the emotional labor or even the physical labor that Palestinians put in to educate, that unless they're educating so that it directly leads to action, that it's just a total waste of time, to be honest. When I started my journey, I believed in dialogue. I believed in encounters or interactions, and I don't anymore, because I've now seen 20 years from when I first went to now, where the situation is worse in Palestine than it was 20 years ago, even. And so all of these programs and all of these things that use the labor for Palestinians to go and take their time and take their energy to do that, it's not changing things unless there is a need for action and there is a need to really break down the political issues that are happening there, not just the kind of interactions as human beings. I mean, yes, we're all human beings. Yes, it's important for people to see Palestinians as human beings, but that's not the issue here. The issue is that there's a white supremacist system in place that was brought there by settler colonialism that is oppressing a group of people. And that needs to be the center of conversations that anyone going there is having. Because if that's not, there's no way to start to break down that system. I would say, I think also, and I saw this come up in the Q&A as well, I think for me, and this goes to what I'm saying, as a Jewish person, I don't feel like I shouldn't have the privilege to just go there and do that, but I do have a responsibility as a Jewish person to take action against this. And that's where I see that, like, the difference between education and activism, or actually where I think it needs to be intertwined, is that I think that if Jews are going to be using their privilege to go there, then they have to have the responsibility to come back and do something with that. And I think my time there, and then my time learning from Palestinians in the diaspora or Palestinians who are studying at the university I was at, who are from Palestine, is where that distinction was made, is that it's not enough to just go and listen and have Palestinians spend their time traveling, as you said, spend time looking up who's in the group and preparing and telling their story over and over again, unless something is really going to happen from it. This goes back to why I'm on this panel, because it's thinking our staff was thinking, well, this panel is put together because of Jewish Currents seeing that they made a mistake? And why is it up to Palestinians to use their time and energy to help right that mistake? And what is the benefit that we're getting from that without any relationship being built beforehand? It's not as if we had a long relationship with Jewish Currents and been working with, they had been working with y'all. And this was, oh, well, we know that Jewish Currents does this and we have been working with them. So we're happy that they want us to be the ones to speak about it. And rather it felt very performative. And so I think that's the difference between centering and including Palestinians. If you're having Palestinians meet with people who are there for 80% of the time doing stuff that is with a Zionist narrative, are you really centering Palestinians or are you including them? And that's the same as sort of in thinking about this panel as well.
Sam, you wanted to say something on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify so I'm not misunderstood. I hear you, Emily, but I also want to be clear that no one is making the claim that talking to any specific group is going to change the world and bring us closer to liberation. What I am saying is something which actually Dr. Khalil Hindi, who was the president of Birzeit University when I served on the board there, gave a talk about. And he said in the education world, the Palestinian education system is getting too dogmatic in terms of training people so they can get a job right after school. And he said that's not the purpose of education. Education teaches you how to think. Then you can go find a job if you know how to think. I would say the same applies here. If we don't open eyes of individuals, and through groups we can do it in a more critical mass, there'll never be an opportunity to pick up on that. Talks themselves will do very little. But this is an ecosystem. We expect Palestinians and solidarity people across the world to be organizing in different ways, means, and forms. So when people do have their eyes open, do see they need to act, they find the next place to go. All that cannot happen in a talking environment. But talking, I think, is something very key. And I should make a distinction here. When I say I talk to all different kinds of groups, there are politically motivated whitewashing groups that I don't speak to blindly. And I say blindly because I may, and I'll give a case here. For example, birthright trips or AIPAC trips or World Zionist Organization trips. I assume that people coming on these trips are already kind of decided. So I would not waste my time there. But again, even in those very right-wing kind of cases, I will look at who is the group. And there was one of these kinds of organizations that brought Hispanic lawmakers who were freshmen in the Congress. These people had no idea about Israel or Palestine, about Zionism or anything, but they came on one of these very right-wing platforms. I went and spoke to them, and it proved to me, and I can talk about it later, that it was worthwhile because these people had zero knowledge. Yes, they were coming on a whitewashing trip, but I confused them by giving them a little bit of the taste of reality. Would I do that consistently with such right-wing? Of course not. So I just think it's more nuanced, and we need to understand that these are real people that are coming. If it's worth speaking to someone who's a lawmaker, I might go through some hoops to get to that person who I don't have access to otherwise. So I think that there needs to be some clarity about how much a talk can actually do. Last thing, I act in my individual capacity. I'm not working with the PLO. I'm not paid to do this. So I think I have the right to put my time wherever I think it's fruitful. If I was part of the organization called the PLO, which is supposed to be leading the Palestinian cause, I may have a very different opinion of how we should deal with such groups. But sadly, the PLO is missing in action today, especially as it comes to educating and motivating the solidarity movement. So it's left up to us individuals to do as much as we can, of course, given this is not our full-time job.
We have a couple of questions about Christian travel to Israel, Palestine, and I wonder if any of the three of you have any experiences or any thoughts that about how the ethics of that might raise different kinds of questions than when you have particularly Jewish groups. Does anyone have something they'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I certainly have. I mean, we work with a lot of church organizations and thinking about, I think that there are issues with Christian pilgrimage tours. And as I would say, I think of the tour guide that we have, Saeed Rabia, who is amazing, who is a Jerusalemite. And, one of the things that he says is that Christian pilgrimage tours come to see the stones. They come to see history, but they don't come to see the living stones, the people that are still there and are still trying to survive. And that there is a problem with that. Because if you're only looking at what's happening in Jerusalem, from what happened during the days that Jesus was there, or, in a historical sense, you're not necessarily seeing what is happening there now. And so, we work with a lot of church organizations, and there are other organizations that do a really wonderful job at this as well, to try and say, well, if you're going to be taking a pilgrimage, how do you actually make sure that where you go, you're not just seeing historical stones, but you're actually meeting with the living stones, the people that are there right now. And, for us, we also know that a lot of people who come on our tours, this might be the only time that they go there. And many of them we have a lot of our delegates are Christian and are coming, are initially attracted to what is happening in Palestine because of their religious background, and because of what they're learning about in their churches. And so, what we make sure to do on our delegations is that, there are always opportunities to visit those historical sites. I would say also for Muslim participants and Jewish participants, we understand that there are a lot of historical places for folks and religiously important places for folks to see, and that is also important. But thinking about, well, how can that be used? And I would say, one of the ways that we've gotten involved with different church groups is actually through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is trying to ask for churches to divest their funds from things that directly oppress Palestinians. And so we've worked with organizations like the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and other church denominations to actually bring people to Palestine to understand what's happening there, so they can come back to their churches' general assemblies and speak on the fact. And so when the Presbyterians had this historical vote to adopt boycott the BDS principles, basically, it happened in part because there were about 20 young 20 to 30-year-olds who had just gone on a trip to Palestine with Eyewitness Palestine and were able to speak about what they saw, what was really happening, and why this decision is so important. And so, those are where I see the sort of ways that travel can really have an effect, and those talks. And I agree. I mean, I don't want you to think I don't agree. I mean, I agree that speaking and learning is a key aspect for sure. But, then taking that and using it. And so we've seen that more and more religious, groups are starting to really focus on, well, how does my religion uphold white supremacy? How does my religion, what issues are they taking on in the US? If they have a Black Lives Matter sign outside, why are they not also taking action on Palestine, and those sort of instances?
I can speak, having spoken to hundreds of church groups, I can tell you the level of ignorance about the issue is about the same as the Jewish community. And if Israel would allow the Muslim community in the Middle East to come, I would expect the level of ignorance about the reality would be about the same as well. One very, very high profile and impactful effort is an organization that was created by a Palestinian American called Telos, who basically analyzed that the evangelical Christian community was having a very heavy weight in this discussion in the US, and created an entire organization to tap into that evangelical community, to bring them here. And leaders of these churches have come, and again, they are completely blind to the reality. So these very specific approaches within the church community are very impactful. And I've spoken to many that Eyewitness Palestine brought, including the Presbyterian group that came.
That's great. I want to just mention to folks that if you look in the chat, there are links to the panelists' bios, also a link to subscribe to Jewish Currents, which I would highly recommend. A link to my newsletter as well, my Substack. So we have just a couple more minutes, and Ilana, I want to give you the last word here. How do you've been talking about the ethics of this? There's the question, it seems to me, of the ethics on the ground. How much time does one spend, under what circumstances with Palestinians is one obligated? Then it seems to me there's also, I'm interested in your question about what about the ethics of when people return? It seems to me one of the, if the point is to have an educational experience that ultimately leads to some kind of moral awakening, it seems to me the danger is that people do have that for a moment, but all of us know in so many parts of our lives, we can have a moment of opening and then something closes down, especially when we go back to our normal environment, especially for Jews who work in Jewish institutions where it would not be easy for them to try to kind of, express and make changes based on. So what are the right ways to try to make sure that people are held accountable once they return, and that this process of moral awakening isn't lost once they lose the immediate encounter?
I think there are two ways that I would suggest thinking about it. One is to take an activist outsider's approach, which is there's a whole array of organizations that you can link up with that are doing this kind of ongoing activism, both within the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community. And one of the best ways to ensure that the educational change that you've been through then doesn't just kind of fizzle out is to become involved with one of those institutions. And I think there's a second strategy, which is overlooked and is harder to see, but from what I hear in conversations, is also to take something of an insider strategy, which is to work to move the institutions from the inside. The more that we have folks who've been on these kinds of eye-opening transformative programs, the more people who have heard Sam Bachor speak, there are hundreds of them at this point, and they're spread out and peppered throughout institutions. And it is also incumbent upon them, and by institutions, I mean Jewish institutions that are not yet progressive on Palestine, and they need to be agitating inside. And so I think the more we can do to make it clear that there's an expectation that either you're explicitly joining some kind of institution, advocacy, activist, organizing framework where you continue your work, many of which exist, or you're looking at how you can be a mover and shaker in ways that we might not always see, but that are out there and happening. Those are two of the ways that I think the work can be continued.
Yeah, I think you've raised such a crucial question, which is one of the things that I think very few of us can really know, because oftentimes established American Jewish organizations from the outside look like these pillars of political and communal power, these kind of citadels of a kind. It's very hard to know from the outside, even if you're in the Jewish community, how many people in these institutions, including at the highest levels, are going to sleep at night thinking, this is not right. That they themselves, and that if there were a change, that they themselves could be moved from forces of the status quo, forces of oppression, to being actually people who, and I don't think anyone, I mean, there may be others who have, I think it's very hard to know, but it's actually something that gives me a small amount of hope, is to think that there's actually, there's more of this than one might recognize from the outside. We have taken the hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time. Sam, Ilana, Emily, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. I'd encourage all of you to get to know more, to read Sam's work, to learn more about Eyewitness Palestine, to learn more about Shlemut. And I hope this is a conversation that Jewish Currents can continue to host in our pages in various forms.